Stories of Old Greece and Rome, originally published in 1913 by Emily Kip Barker. A link to this public domain work is in the description. If you'd like to skip the short introduction, please refer to the timestamps provided. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that this work often uses the Roman equivalent names for Greek gods, but the stories are the same in character. For example, Zeus is referred to as Jupiter, Poseidon as Neptune, and Hades as Pluto. I will provide a full list of these equivalences in the pinned comments for your convenience. If you'd like to browse them briefly before we begin, please feel free to do so. Now, let's get nice and relaxed, and we can start together back in the ancient world. Prometheus, the Beginningg. In the days of long, long ago, when men built altars and burned sacrifices and worshipped their gods in temples of pure white marble, Jupiter, the greatest of the gods, sat upon his throne on high Olympus and looked down upon the doings of men. The topmost peak of Mount Olympus was covered with clouds, so high that it was above all the hills of Greece, and its slopes were thickly wooded. Just how high the mountain really was could be anybody's guess, for no man had ever dared to climb even as high as the first line of clouds, though the story goes that once upon a time a wandering shepherd, looking for a strayed lamb, had ventured far up the mountainside and had soon lost his way. He groped about blindly as the mists began to thicken all around him, and the sound of his own footsteps terrified him in the dreadful silence that seemed to be suddenly creeping over him. Then a mighty tempest broke over his head, and the mountain shook to its very base. From the hand of wrathful Jupiter, fierce thunderbolts were hurled, while the lightning flashed and gleamed through the darkness of the forest, searching out the guilty mortal who had dared to climb too high. No human eye had ever seen the glories of Olympus. No human foot had ever stepped within its sacred halls, where the ceiling was of gold, and the pavement of pearl, and thrones of gods shone with 1,000 glittering jewels. Here the gods have made, so saith the tradition, their eternal seat. The tempest shakes it not, nor is it drenched by showers, and there the snow never falls, and in the golden light that lies on all day after day the blessed gods rejoice. Of the life that was lived among the dwellers on Olympus, not even the poets could claim to know. But sometimes a tired soldier dozing by his campfire dreamed dreams of this wonderful land, where the immortal gods walked by night and day, and sometimes a lonely fisherman, looking across the blue waters of the Mediterranean to the crimsoning sunset, saw visions of youth and beauty and life that lasted forever and ever. It was long before the memory of man that the gods first came to live on Mount Olympus, and it was still longer ago that all the great powers of the universe fought with each other for the right to rule the world. In this mighty war, which rent the very heavens with the crash of battle, Jupiter at last conquered all his jealous enemies, and made himself the ruler of the gods and of the world. On that day he established his dwelling place on Mount Olympus, and set the earth below him for a footstool. From his throne in the high heavens he looked down upon the kingdoms that he had portioned out to each of his brothers, and he saw Neptune, the god of the sea, driving through the waves his chariot drawn by a huge misshapen sea beast that beat up thick white foam until it glistened on the sea king's beard and on his crown of shells and seaweed. The other kingdom was so far away that even the all-seeing eyes of Jupiter were strained to catch any glimpse of the shapes that moved noiselessly there. For this was the realm of Pluto, god of the underworld, the dread country of darkness and never-ending gloom, where no ray of sunlight could ever reach, and where the sad spirits of the dead wept for the lost world of love, light, and laughter. Sometimes the great billows of the cloud that rolled at the foot of the red gold throne shut out for a moment all sight of earth at its feet. But however thickly the mists could gather, Jupiter could always see old Atlantis on the shore of Africa, with the heavens resting on his bent shoulders. This giant, who had stood so long that forests of huge trees had sprung up around his feet, and they had grown so tall during the ages and ages that had passed, that their topmost branches reached to the giant's waist, and almost hid him from the sight of men. No one offered to relieve him of his burden, not even his two brothers, Prometheus and Epimetheus, to whom had been given the less difficult task of creating man and placing him in the rich gardens of the earth. There was every kind of plant and animal life in these gardens, and all things were beautiful in this morning of the world, so beautiful that the gods, who must forever dwell in Olympus, felt sad that no eyes like their own could look upon the green meadows and flower-covered hillsides. And so they decided that Prometheus and Epimetheus would fashion a being which should be like, but yet unlike themselves. This was nothing but clay that they had, out of which to make this new creature called man. But the brothers spent much time over their task, and when it was finished, Jupiter saw that the work was good, for they had given to man all qualities that the gods themselves possessed: youth, beauty, health, strength, everything but immortality. And then Prometheus grew ambitious to add even more to the list of man's blessings. And one day, as he sat brooding by the seashore, he remembered that there was as yet no fire on the earth, for the only flame that burned in all the world was glowing in the sacred halls of Jupiter. For a long time he sat on the seashore, and before night fell he had formed the daring plan of stealing some of the divine fire that burned for always and always on top of Mount Olympus, and carrying it to the earth, that men might also revel in its warmth at night. It was a bold thing to dream of doing, but Prometheus forgot the fear of Jupiter's wrath. So determined was he to carry out his plan. And one night, when the gods were in council, seated around the red gold throne, he crept softly into the hall, unseen and unheard. The sacred fire was burning brightly on a hearth of polished silver. Some of it Prometheus secreted into a hollow reed and hurried away, back to the earth. Then he waited, with terror in his heart, for he knew that sooner or later the vengeance of Jupiter would search him out, even though he fled to the uttermost parts of the earth. When the council of gods was over, Jupiter looked down through the clouds and saw a strange light on the earth. For a while he did not realize that it was man building himself a fire. But when he learned the truth, his wrath became so terrible that even the gods trembled and turned away in fear. In a moment, Prometheus was seized and carried off to the Caucasus Mountains, where he was securely chained to a rock, and a hungry vulture was sent to tear out his liver and devour it. At night, the vulture, having gorged itself, slept on the rocks above its victim's head, and at night the liver of the wretched Prometheus grew again, only to be torn out and eaten by the vulture as soon as the sun rose. This terrible punishment kept on for years and years, for though Jupiter heard the cries of Prometheus, and many tales were told of his sufferings, the ruler of the gods never forgave the theft of the sacred fire, nor would he set Prometheus free. But the story tells us that at last there came an end to this cruel vengeance, for Hercules, the son of Jupiter, went wandering one day among the mountains, found the tortured Prometheus, and broke his chains. After killing the vulture that had been enjoying this hateful feast. Though the gods rejoiced at his freedom, the name of Prometheus was never spoken on Mount Olympus for fear of Jupiter's all-hearing ears. But on the earth men uttered his name in their prayers, and taught their children to honor the one who gave them fire as the greatest among heroes. And now, the story of Pandora. In the early days of man's life on the earth, when everything was so beautiful and so new, there was no sickness to be found, nor any pain nor sorrow. Indeed, men lived to be very old, and very wise at that, and everywhere was happiness, such as has never been seen since in all the world. Now, Jupiter had not forgotten about the stealing of the sacred fire, and it angered him that man should light his own fires and kindle the cheerful blaze which should by rights be glowing only in the halls of Olympus. The suffering of Prometheus had not softened his wrath. He would not be satisfied until punishment was visited upon those who received the stolen fire. Accordingly, he called a council of the gods and spoke to them of his desire. though none of the deities wished to see misfortune brought upon the race of man, they did not dare to dispute the will of Jupiter. And so they agreed to carry out the plan that he unfolded, and before many days had passed, they had fashioned, out of the same clay from which man was made, a creature that they called woman. To her each of the gods gave a gift, such as softness, or grace, or wonderful fairness. But Jupiter added another quality, curiosity, and he gave the woman the name of Pandora, which means the gift of all the gods. And then he bade Mercury, who is the messenger of the gods, take this new soft thing down to the earth, and give her to Prometheus for his wife. Now, Prometheus had mourned apart from his fellows ever since he learned of his brother's dreadful fate, and he sat day and night in the cool silence of the forest, brooding over his sorrow. But one day he saw someone coming towards him, led by the hand of Mercury, and all at once he forgot his sadness, for the sunlight was shining on the woman's golden hair, and her white arm was stretched out to him in greeting. For some time, Prometheus and Pandora lived happily in the gardens of the earth, and every day Prometheus thanked the gods for their last and greatest gift to man. He never tired of watching Pandora chasing butterflies through the tall grasses of the meadows, or making cups out of broad leaves, that she and Prometheus might drink from the clear, cool spring. One day, as they were resting under the trees and eating their simple meal of dates and wild honey, they saw a traveler coming towards them. He was walking very slowly, and seemed to be heavily burdened with what appeared to be a large box. While he was yet some distance off, Pandora ran to meet him, and asked him to come into the shade and rest a little while. The stranger was old, and the chest that he carried bent his shoulders almost to the ground. He looked so hungry and thirsty and tired, so Prometheus urged him to stop and rest, and offered him some freshly gathered dates. But this traveler was none other than Mercury in disguise. He replied that he could not tarry with them, for he had a long distance yet to travel. He did ask them, however, to take care of this great oaken chest, for with that burden off his shoulders he could hurry on and reach his journey's end before nightfall. He promised to come back for the chest a few days later. Prometheus and Pandora were delighted to be of service to the stranger, and promised to guard the chest with the greatest of care. The traveler thanked them and turned away, but just as they were saying goodbye, so mysteriously he disappeared, and whichever way they looked, there was no trace of him to be seen. Well, Prometheus was not at all eager to know what was in the mysterious chest, but as soon as they sat down again under the trees, Pandora began to ask 1,000 questions as to who the traveler might be and what the chest contained. Prometheus begged her not to think any more about it, as nothing could be learned of the old man or his burden, But Pandora refused to be silent, and talked still more of the probable treasure that they were guarding for this mysterious stranger. At last, Epimetheus got up, angrily, and he walked away, wearied with her insistent questioning. And then Pandora went over to the chest, and kneeling down beside it, she examined the exquisitely carved figures that were on all four of its sides. Then she studied the fine golden cord that bound the chest. It looked soft enough, and yet it was very strong, for it was made of strands of twisted gold, and it was tied at the end with a curious knot. There was no lock to be seen, and apparently nothing hindered eager fingers from opening the lid when once the knot was unfastened and the golden cord unwound. Pandora's fingers itched to try her skill on the knot, and she felt that if she worked long enough at it, she could finally get it loose. The figures carved on the lid were groups of dancing children, and in the very center was one figure whose face was so strange that Pandora sat for a long time staring at it. Now and then she turned away, and when she looked at the face again, it had a different expression from the one she had seen on it before. She knew that this carved thing was not alive, and yet, each time she gazed into the strange eyes of the wooden face, they were quite unlike the eyes that had smiled or frowned or mocked at her the last time she looked. She went to see whether Epimetheus had come back, and finding that he was still away, she returned to the chest again, but would not let herself be tempted into so much as touching the golden cord. But as she stood wondering what to do, she thought that she heard some little voices coming from inside the chest, and they seemed to say, "Open, Pandora. Please, please open and let us out." Pandora looked quickly around to see whether Epimetheus were in sight. Then she came a bit nearer to the chest and put one hand on the golden cord. Again she heard the small voices, this time very distinctly, and they said, "Open, Pandora. Please, please open and let us out." Pandora's heart was now beating. It was beating so fast. What could be in the chest? What poor imprisoned creatures were calling to her, begging her to simply set them free? She put both hands on the golden cord. Then she looked guiltily around, but no one was in sight. No one was watching her, except some inquisitive squirrels who were peering down at her from the branches just above her head. Swiftly and deftly, she untied the knot, which yielded easily to her eager fingers. But even then she hesitated, fearing the anger of Epimetheus. And then the little voices cried out again, "Open, Pandora! Please, please open and let us out!" But she still hesitated, not daring to raise the lid. Just then she heard her husband calling to her, and she knew there would be no chance now to explore the contents of the mysterious chest. She must wait for that pleasure until another time. Meanwhile, she would take just one peep inside, or just to be sure that the voices were not mocking her. Just a little look. And so she raised the lid very, very gently. But no sooner had she made the smallest opening than out poured a host of tiny creatures like brown-winged moths, and they swarmed all around her, biting and pinching and blistering her soft skin until she cried out in fear and pain. She tried to fight them off, and rushed away to find Prometheus, but the tormenting little sprites followed her, buzzing about her ears and stinging her again and again and again. In vain she strove to brush them away, for they clung to her dress, her hair, and her poor swollen skin. When she reached Prometheus, she was crying bitterly, and did not need any questioning to find out the trouble, for the malicious little creatures were so numerous that hundreds of them encircled Prometheus, and bit and stung him, just as they had done to Pandora. In the unhappy hour that followed, while husband and wife bound soothing herbs on their bruised skin, Pandora told Prometheus how her fatal curiosity had led her to open the chest and free the host of evil things. It was not, however, until later that they realized the extent of Pandora's folly, for the little brown-winged creatures were all the spirits of evil that had never before entered the world, and they all had names. Their names were sickness and pain and sorrow, envy and pride and jealousy, hunger, poverty, and death. All these ills had envious Jupiter put into the oak chest and bound it with only a golden cord. He knew that sooner or later Pandora would open the chest, and then man's life of untroubled happiness would be at an end forever. Never again could the gardens of the earth be places where man might hope to find peace. Evil things had taken up their dwelling there, and they would stay for always and always and always, as long as the world should last. When Prometheus and Pandora saw the hateful winged creatures settling down on the leaves and flowers so as to be near at hand to torment them, they wept bitter tears and wished that the gods had never created them. In the midst of her sobbing, Pandora had not, however, forgotten about the chest, and she was still wondering what else might be inside it, for she was sure that those moth-like things could never have wholly filled it. And suddenly she heard a soft whisper coming from within the chest. "Open, Pandora. Please, please open and let me out." Pandora stared in surprise, for she had thought that all the evil sprites had surely rushed out in that moment that she opened that dreadful lid. Was there, then, perhaps another host of tormenting things still there? And if so, should she let them out, only to add to her misery and pain? "Open, Pandora. Please, please open and let me out." Pandora now called to Prometheus, and together they listened to the pleading of the voice, which was so very soft and sweet that they were sure it could not belong to any evil thing. Still, Prometheus was unwilling to risk bringing any more trouble into the world, but in spite of her remorse, Pandora was curious to see what it was that was begging so plaintively for freedom. So, with the consent of Prometheus, she opened the lid once more, and out fluttered a tiny little creature with beautiful gauzy wings. She flew straight to Pandora, then to Prometheus, and at her touch all their hurts were healed, and all their pain was forgotten. The name of this gentle messenger was Hope, and she had been hidden in the chest secretly by one of the pitying gods, who grieved that Jupiter was sending so many ills to fret mankind. The host of evil beings, once set free, could never again be shut up in their narrow prison, but wherever they flew, even to the remotest corner of the earth, Hope followed behind them and brought healing in her wings. And when their world grew wicked, as it did in the days that came after, so that men neglected the altars of the gods, Hope was still remembered with votive offerings, and her shrines kept well garlanded with flowers. I hope you're enjoying everything so far. We're having a great time, aren't we? Next up is the story of the flood. I'm sure perhaps you'll recognize certain parts of it. The children of Prometheus and Pandora wandered in the gardens of the earth, just as their parents had done, and the generations that followed them lived peacefully and were happy, in spite of the brown-winged sprites that went about doing so much mischief. Men helped each other to cultivate the fruitful soil, and offered sacrifices to the gods in return for a bountiful harvest. The golden age of the world's history might have lasted forever if men had continued to reverence the gods, but after a time they ceased to offer prayers for health and safety, and even boasted proudly of their own strength. They looked no more to high Olympus for help, but each man trusted to his own right arm. Then strife and discord arose, and fierce wars were fought among all peoples of the earth. Brother killed brother, and fathers strove with their own sons. Every man's hand was against the other, and he knew no law but that of his own will. Seldom now were the fires kindled on the neglected altars, and the smell of burnt offerings dear to the gods no longer mingled with the smoke that rose up to the white clouds around Olympus. The sacred vessels mouldered in forsaken temples. Around the shrines of the gods the snakes crawled lazily and free, and the bat and the owl dwelt undisturbed among the pillars and temples. For a time the gods sat patient, believing that this state of things simply could not last. But seeing that mankind was growing worse instead of better, year by year, they determined to put an end to the godlessness and destroy the entire race of man. Then Jupiter called a council of the gods to decide on the most effective way of wiping out every vestige of human life so completely that not one soul would be left to tell his children the story of those evil days when men neglected to worship the immortal gods and allowed their temples to decay. The most terrible punishment to visit upon man would be to set the whole world on fire, to make of it one great sacrificial altar on which human victims, and not the garlanded ox, would burn night and day, and from which the smoke would rise up into the heavens so thickly that it would shut out the sight of a blackened and smouldering earth. The one objection to carrying out this plan was the fear lest the flames would leap so high that they would even reach up to the lofty Olympus, and so endanger the sacred throne of Jupiter. Though the fire might not utterly destroy it, the gods could not bear to think of its burnished red gold base being touched by any flame from the earth's unholy fires. The only other effective method of destruction was water, and this the gods decided to employ. So on a certain day, when men were everywhere feasting and singing songs and boasting of their victories in battle, Jupiter rent the heavens with a mighty thunderbolt, whose crashing drowned all the sounds of merriment, and made men turn pale with fear. Then the skies opened, and the rain poured down in torrents. The rivers became swollen and flooded. The waves of the sea, rising higher and higher, swept in a great fury over the land, washing everything before them like so much chaff. Aeolus, the god of the storm, opened the cave where he kept the winds securely bound, and let them loose to wreak havoc upon the earth. Soon all the lowland was covered with water. Not a dry spot remained anywhere but on the hills, and thither the terrified people rushed in vain hope that the flood would subside before the mountain was submerged. But the waves rose higher and higher, and the winds, rejoicing in their freedom, beat up the water until it almost touched the clouds. The frail boats to which men had at first desperately clung were shattered to pieces in the great fury of the storm, and on the crest of the waves the bodies of the dead were tossed like playthings. Higher and higher rose the water, until at length the mountain tops were covered, and all dry land had completely disappeared. So were the gods avenged. But there was one spot, however, that was not yet hidden under the waters, and this was the top of Mount Parnassus, the highest in Greece. To this place of refuge had fled Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha, two virtuous souls who alone of all people on the earth had lived uprightly and worshipped the gods. When Jupiter saw them standing on top of Mount Parnassus and weeping over the universal destruction, he remembered their piety and decreed that their lives should be spared. And so he gave commands that the rains and the floods and the winds should finally cease, and the dry land appear. Then Aeolus brought the winds back from their mad wanderings, and bound them again in a cave. Neptune blew upon his conch shell, and the angry waves, returning again to the sea. Little by little the tree-tops showed above the water, and the green earth smiled again under the warm rays of the golden sun. But it was upon a desolate and unpeopled world that the eyes of Deucalion and Pyrrha rested, and in their utter loneliness they almost wished that they had perished along with their friends. They went slowly down the mountainside, not knowing where to go, being led blindly by the will of the gods to the temple at Delphi, the only building that was not destroyed. To this sacred spot men had been wont to come in the old God-fearing days to consult the wishes of the gods and to learn of their own destinies. Here was the divine oracle that not even the most daring mortal would refuse to obey. When Deucalion and Pyrrha found themselves at the temple of Delphi, they made haste to consult the oracle, for they wished to re-people the land before another morning sun could look down upon a lifeless earth. To their surprise, the oracle returned them this answer: "Depart from here with veiled heads, and throw your mother's bones behind you." This command seemed impossible to obey, for they could never hope to find any grave when all landmarks had been washed away, and even could they so do it, it was unheard of to sacrilege and disturb the bones of the dead. Deucalion sought, therefore, to explain the strange words of the oracle in some other way, and at length he guessed that the meaning of the god's answer was thusly. It was no human remains that he was commanded to desecrate. The bones referred to were those of Mother Earth. So husband and wife left the temple with veiled heads, and as soon as they went, they gathered up the stones at their feet and threw these behind them. All the stones that fell from the hands of Deucalion turned into men, and those that Pyrrha dropped became women. Thus it was that through the kindness and wisdom of the immortals that the earth was re-peopled with a new race of men, this time that feared evil and reverenced piety and walked humbly before the gods. Never again was Jupiter forced to send a deluge upon the earth, for men no longer let the altar fires burn low, nor did they neglect to offer sacrifices because of forgotten prayers. Minerva. Although the brown-winged spirits of evil were kept busy flying up and down the earth, their mischief-making never reached those immortal ones who dwelt above the cloud-wrapped summit of Olympus. It was, therefore, a most unheard-of happening when the father of the gods complained one day of a terrible pain in his head. Some of the gods were skilled in the art of healing, but no one could relieve Jupiter's suffering, nor tell what might be the cause of his pain. The trouble grew worse and worse until it was too severe for even a god to endure. So Jupiter bade his son Vulcan take an axe and split his head open. Not daring to thwart the divine will, Vulcan tremblingly obeyed, and at the first blow a marvelous thing did occur, for out of Jupiter's head sprung a maiden, clad in armor and bearing a spear in her hand. This was Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, so called because she came full-grown from the mighty brain of Jupiter. So wise did the ruler of the gods find this child of his to be, that he kept her constantly near him, and sought her counsel in dealing with the affairs of men, while Juno, his stately wife, stood jealously by, envying the warrior maiden her place at Jupiter's side. Being born equipped for battle, Minerva delighted in war, and had no feminine shrinking from the noise of clashing steel and the cries of struggling men. No Trojan hero gloried in the war more exultingly than she, and she carried aloft the terrible shield of Jupiter, the Aegis, and bore in her hand the mighty spear, heavy and huge and strong. When armies met in battle, the goddess was never far away from the fighting host, and ofttimes a dying soldier, turning his eyes for a last look at his comrades, saw a glint of her spear or the flash of her shield as she led the favored side to victory. However, the azure-eyed Minerva was not always on the battlefield, for in spite of her warlike appearance, she had many very feminine tastes, and among them was a love of weaving. Often would white-armored Juno taunt Minerva with her unwomanly fondness for warfare, but when the goddess took up her weaving, even jealous Juno could not withhold her praise, for the hand that could wield a spear like a man also had the delicate touch of a woman. Now, there lived on earth a maiden named Arachne, who was very proud of her skill in weaving, and boasted that in the whole length and breadth of the land there was no one equal to her in this art. Whenever people spoke with her, she could talk nothing else but her work, and if a stranger stopped to rest at her door, she would be sure to show them her weaving, and ask him whether in all his wanderings he had seen anything to surpass it. Soon she grew so conceited that she dared compare herself with the goddess Minerva, and boasted that her own work was as beautiful as anything that hung in the halls of Olympus. And thus her friends grew frightened at her rash speech, and began to tell her not to let her foolish pride go too far, lest some whisper of her boasting reach Minerva's ears. But Arachne grew bolder, and said openly that she would not be afraid to challenge the goddess to a contest. These words were overheard by Apollo's raven, who flew quickly back to Olympus to tell what he had seen and heard. Minerva had known for some time of Arachne's boasting, but she had not deigned to notice it. Now, however, when she learned that a mortal maiden had claimed superiority to a goddess, she grew very angry, and determined to punish such presumption. And so she cast off her glittering armor and laid aside her spear, and went down to earth in the disguise of an old woman. She found Arachne seated on the doorstep, weaving, and as she stopped to admire the girl's work, even Minerva was forced to admit that the weaving was indeed beautifully done. Soon Arachne began to boast proudly of her skill, and told the pretended old woman that she hoped some day to challenge the goddess Minerva to a contest. The listener seemed shocked at these daring words, and begged the maiden to be more humble, not to presume so far, but Arachne tossed her head back and laughed, saying that she wished the goddess would hear her and come down and accept her challenge. Well, at these bold words, the anger of Minerva broke out, and throwing off her disguise, she commanded the astonished girl to fetch 2 looms and set them up in the doorway. Then she bade Arachne to make good on her boast, For hours they worked in silence, each weaving with practiced fingers an exquisite design in the tapestry, and neither one turning their head to watch their rival's progress. When the last thread was tied, and the work was finished, Arachne looked anxiously over at the loom of the goddess, and one glance was sufficient to assure her of her own failure. Never in all her life had she seen work so faultlessly done, and the beauty of it was like that of her visions in a dream. Humiliated by her defeat, and too proud to endure the taunts that she felt awaited her from those who had heard her boast, the unhappy maiden tried to hang herself. But Minerva would not let the world so easily forget how a mortal had dared to challenge a goddess. So, when she saw Arachne's body hanging by a rope, she quickly changed her into a spider, and bade her spin and spin as long as she lived. Thus, when strangers came from all the country round to see the maiden whose skill in weaving had been noised far and wide, there she hung, an ugly black spider, in the midst of her dusty web, a warning to all mortals. Many, many years had passed since Prometheus and Pandora wandered in the gardens of the earth, and many generations of men had come and gone since the day when Deucalion and Pyrrha looked down from Mount Parnassus upon an unpeopled land. Cities had been built, with marble palaces and costly temples. Towns had sprung up on the river banks and by the sea. Everywhere man was making himself a home and journeying into strange and distant lands. The gods, seated in the council hall of Jupiter, watched the changes taking place upon the earth, and as each new city was built and the flames of its altar fires rose up towards the white clouds around Olympus, they smiled upon the work of man's hand and made it prosper. Nowhere was the worship of the gods forgotten, but in each undertaking the protection of some deity was sought, and a sacrifice offered that success might be assured. Scattered throughout the land, in town or by the wayside, were shrines where the farmer laid his offering of doves in return for a rich harvest, or a soldier hung some trophy of victory upon his safe return from the war, or a sailor, starting on some uncertain voyage, burned spices and incense that the gods might grant favoring winds to all who go down to the sea in ships. But in every city there was one temple that was more beautiful than the rest, and this was dedicated to that particular deity who had came and named the city, and was its especial protector. And as after city was built throughout the fair land of Greece, each of the gods wished to have the naming of it, that he might thereby receive added worship and honor. Of course, there was much jealousy among them on this score, and they watched eagerly each thriving inland town or seaport, knowing that in a few years it would become a great city, building costly temples and erecting statues to gods whom delighted to honor. So once, when a certain town on the coast of Greece began to grow into a large and prosperous city, there was much dispute in the council of the hall of Jupiter as to who should have the privilege of naming it. Perhaps the gods were looking far into the future and saw what the city was destined to become. But, however that may be, the gods and goddesses argued so fiercely over the matter that Jupiter was obliged to interfere, lest some murmur of its unusual discord shall reach the earth. Then one by one the various contestants withdrew, until only Neptune and Minerva were left to dispute over their respective rights to naming the city. There being no ground for either's claim, Jupiter at length decided to give the much-coveted honor to whichever of these two would present the most useful gift to the people of the city. Neptune then struck the ground with his trident, and where the earth opened there sprang out a horse with a snow-white mane, and arching its neck, and a splendid body on which a king might be proud to ride. The gods and goddesses, who had assembled to witness the contest, were delighted with Neptune's gift, and waited impatiently to see what a better thing Minerva would be able to offer. Surprise, amusement, and contempt were written on the faces of the spectators when the goddess stepped forward, holding in her hand an olive branch. But Jupiter, wisest of them all, did not smile, for he was listening while Minerva told of the great value her gift would have for the people of the city. She described all the uses of which its leaves, its fruit, and even its bark could be put, adding that the olive branch was to be a sign of peace among all nations, and was therefore of more true service to a man than a war horse, which would bring upon him only bloodshed and disaster. To these wise words the gods were forced to agree. So to Minerva was granted the privilege of naming the city, and, as she was called Athena by the Greeks, she named the place Athens, which it is called to this very day. Before many years passed, a splendid marble temple was built on the hill just above the city, and this was dedicated to Athena, whose colossal statue, carved by the famous sculptor Phidias, adorned the interior. They called this temple the Parthenon, and from the ruins that still remain, we know that the hand of man has never built anything equal to it in beauty. Apollo and King Admetus. There would have been but little trouble between Jupiter and his stately wife if no one but Minerva ever gave the watchful Juno cause for jealousy. But the other goddesses, and even mortal maidens, found favor in the eyes of Jupiter, and for their sake he often left her side. From his time in the high heavens, the ruler of the world saw not only the goddesses, with their glory of immortal youth, but also the daughters of men, endowed with that same beauty and grace which the gods themselves had bestowed upon the first woman. Though Juno, of snow-white arms, alone enjoyed the title of Queen of Heaven, she knew that she had many rivals for the love of Jupiter, and it was this jealousy of all loveliness in woman that made her ever watchful and vengeful. Perhaps it was the cause, too, of the very changeable temper that her husband accused her of possessing. Whoever won the affections of Jupiter was sure to be persecuted by cruel Juno's unrelenting hate, as the poet Virgil says. But this did not hinder the ruler of the gods from leaving very often the marble halls of Olympus to wander, in some disguise, about the earth. It was after such an absence that the watchful Juno learned of Jupiter's love for the fair-haired Latona, goddess of dark nights. As this new rival was not a mortal maiden who could be punished with death, the wrathful queen was forced to be content with banishing the goddess forever from Olympus and compelling her to live upon the earth. But not satisfied with this, she decreed that anyone who took pity on the unhappy goddess or gave her any help would incur the lasting displeasure of Juno. For days and nights, Latona wandered, not daring to ask for food or shelter, since all men knew of Juno's decree. She slept at night in some spot where the trees offered protection from wind and rain, and her only food was the scanty store that she could gather by the way, berries, nuts, wild honey, and sometimes bits of bread dropped by children in their play. One day, being very thirsty, she stopped beside a clear pool to drink, but some reapers who were passing by saw her, and hoping to gain favor with Juno, they stepped into the pool and stirred up the water into such muddiness that poor Latona could not drink. Angered by such uncalled-for cruelty, the goddess prayed to Jupiter that these wicked men might never leave the spot from where they stood. Jupiter from his throne in the high heavens heard her prayer, and in answer he turned the reapers into ugly green frogs and bade them to stay forever in that muddy pool. And ever afterward, when men came upon the slimy ponds, where rank weeds grew and water oozed from muddy banks, there they found the blinking frogs, even as Jupiter had willed. After wandering some miles further, Latona came at last to the seashore, and here she begged Neptune, the god who shakes the shores, to come to her aid, for she knew that Juno's power did not extend to the ruler of the sea. Seeing her distress and pitying the poor persecuted goddess, Neptune sent her a dolphin, who took her on his back and swam with her to the floating island of Delos, which the kindly sea god had caused to appear out of the depth of the ocean. Here Latona landed, and for a time was content, but the rocking of the island soon grew unbearable, and she begged the aid of Neptune a second time. He obligingly chained the island to the bottom of the Aegean Sea, and Latona had no further cause for complaint. On this island her 2 children were born, Apollo, the god of the sun, and Diana, the goddess of the moon. When the children were grown, Jupiter took them to Olympus, though not without much protest from the ever-jealous Juno. The young Apollo's beauty and his skill in music gained him great favor among the gods, and they found him worshippers in every town and city throughout the land of Greece. So conscious of his power did Apollo become that he sometimes dared to assert his authority, unmindful of the will of Jupiter, and on one occasion he so angered his divine parent that he was banished to the earth and made to serve Admetus, the king of Thessaly. In spite of his disgrace, Apollo managed to cheer his lonely hours of labor with his music, and as his work was no more difficult than to care for the king's sheep, he had abundant leisure to play upon his lyre while his flocks grazed in the sunny hillsides. As soon as he touched the strings, all the wild things in the forest crept out to hear. The fox came slinking from his hole among the rocks, and the timid deer drew close to the player and stayed beside him listening. The strains of the wonderful music were carried across the meadows, and the mowers stopped their work, wondering where the player might be. One day they brought word to the king that some god must be among them, for no mortal could produce such music as they had heard. So Admetus sent for the shepherd, and when the youth stood before him, he marveled at his great beauty, and still more at the golden lyre that Apollo held in his hand. And then, when the young musician, in obedience to the king's command, began to play, all those who heard him were filled with wonder, and felt sure that a god had come to dwell among them. But Admetus asked no questions, only made the youth his head shepherd, and treated him with all kindness. Though a god, and no true shepherd, Apollo served the king faithfully, and when at last his time of service was over, and Jupiter called him back to Olympus, Apollo, wishing to show some favor in return for the king's kindness, begged Admetus the gift of immortality. This request the wise Jupiter granted, but only on the condition that when the time came for the king to die, someone could be found to take his place. Apollo agreed to these terms, and Admetus, knowing the conditions on which the gift was made, accepted his immortality gladly. For a time, all went well, but the inevitable hour came when the fates decreed that Admetus's life was ended, and that he must go the way of all mortals, unless some would die in his stead. The king was much beloved by his people, of course, but no one's devotion to his sovereign was great enough to inspire him to make the needed sacrifice. Then Alcestis, the beautiful wife of Admetus, learned of the price that must be paid for her husband's immortality, and gladly offered her life in exchange for the king's. And so, in all her young grace and beauty, she went down into the dark region of Hades, where no sunlight ever came, and where her joyous laughter was forever hushed in the silence that reigns among the dead. Thus Admetus gained immortality, but his happiness was too dearly bought, for as the days went by, he mourned more and more for his beautiful young wife, and in his dreams he saw her walking like a shadow among the grim shapes that moved noiselessly in the silent halls of death. Bitterly he repented of his selfishness in accepting the sacrifice her life, and his immortality grew hateful to him, since each day only added to his sorrow. And so he prayed to Apollo to recall his gift, and to give back his wife Alcestis. It was not in the power of that god to change a decree of Jupiter, but the ruler of all things looked down from heaven, and seeing the great grief and remorse of Admetus, he withdrew the gift that had cost the king so much, and sent Hercules to the kingdom of Pluto with commands to let Alcestis go. Very gladly the god carried this message to the gloomy realm of Hades, where amid the myriad shadow shapes he sought and finally found Alcestis, and out of the dreadful darkness in which she walked alone, Hercules led her back to earth again. Apollo, the musician. When Apollo left King Admetus, and returned to the halls of Olympus. He had not rested there long before he found that there was further service for him to render back on the earth. Among the many noted deeds that he performed, the most famous was his slaying of a monstrous serpent called the Python, which was born of the slime and remained on the surface of the earth after the deluge. Apollo killed the creature with his glorious golden arrows, and then went to the help of Neptune, who, though a powerful deity in his own realm, was often obliged to ask the help of other gods when he wished to accomplish anything on land. Hearing that Neptune wished to build a great wall around the city of Troy, and remembering the aid of that sea god had given to his mother Latona in her great need, Apollo went down to the sea and offered his services to Neptune. Of course, no son of Jupiter could be expected to do the work of a slave, but this was not necessary, even in the building of a wall, for Apollo sat down on a grassy bank nearby, and with his lyre in his hand he began to play such exquisite music that the very stones were bewitched, and rising from the ground of their own accord, took their places in the wall. Still under the spell of Apollo's music, others followed in quick succession, and the wall rose higher and higher and higher, until before nightfall all of the work was finished. When the last stone had dropped into place, Apollo stopped his playing and returned to the bright halls of Olympus, while Neptune, shaking the salt spray from his shaggy eyebrows, stared hard at the walls that had risen by magic before his wondering eyes. The story of Arachne's sad fate should have been warning enough to all mortals not to compare themselves with the gods, but such was the pride of a certain youth named Marsyas that he boasted openly of his skill in flute playing and dared to proclaim himself as the equal to Apollo. Now, Marsyas had not always been a musician, you see, for he was by birth a shepherd. Some even say he was a satyr, and had never seen a flute or heard it played until one day, as he sat tending his flock on the bank of a stream, he heard the sounds of music coming from some spot nearby. He was very curious to see who the musician might be, but he dared not move, lest he startle the player and make the beautiful melody cease. So he sat still and waited, and presently there came floating down the stream a flute, something that Marsyas had never seen before. He hurriedly snatched it out of the water, and no longer hearing the wonderful music, he guessed that it had come from this strange thing that he now held in his hand. He put the flute to his lips, and lo, the same sweet melody greeted his ears, for the flute was not a common thing such as any man might use. It was a beautiful instrument that belonged to no less a person than Minerva. The goddess had hidden herself on the bank of the stream, and had been trying her skill as a flute player. But chancing to look down into the water, she saw her puffed-out cheeks and distorted features, and angrily threw the flute back into the stream. Thus it come into Marsyas's possession, and the shepherd, having found such a treasure, never let it leave his hands. He neglected his work, and left his flocks unguarded, while he spent all his days in the delights of music. It was not long before he believed himself to be the greatest musician in all of Greece, And then it was only a step further to declare that even Apollo could not equal him in the sweetness of his playing. The god of music allowed this boasting to go on for some time unpunished, but at last he grew angry at the presumption of the shepherd boy, and summoned Marsyas to a contest in which the 9 muses were to be judges. Nothing daunted, Marsyas accepted the challenge, and on the morning when the contest took place, a great silence fell over all of the earth, as if every living thing had stopped to listen. The playing of Marsyas was wonderfully sweet, and as the soft tones of his flute greeted the listeners' ears, they sat as if under a spell until the final seconds died away. And then Apollo took up his golden lyre, and when he struck the first chords, the air was filled with music far sweeter than any melody that had fallen from the lips of Marsyas. But the judges found it hard to give a verdict in favor of either musician. So, a second time Marsyas began to play, and his music was so strangely wild and sweet that even Apollo listened in delight. But charmed as he was by the youth's playing, the god of music had no intention of being outdone, especially by a shepherd. So when he took up his golden lyre again, he began to sing, and added the wonder of his voice to the sweetness of his playing. When the singing ended, there was no longer any doubt whom the victory belonged, and Marsyas was forced to admit defeat. As the price of failure was to be the terrible penalty of being flayed alive, the wretched Marsyas had to submit to this cruel death. Apollo bound him to a tree and slew him with his own hands. When the news of Marsyas's dreadful fate spread abroad, people were careful for many years not to anger any of the deities by presuming to rival them. But in time, the memory of that tragic event slowly faded away, and the horror of it was all but forgotten. In the halls of King Midas was the noise of great mirth and feasting, and the sound of music filled the spacious room where the king and his court sat at the banquet table. Beside the king stood Pan, his favorite flute player, who was no other than the famous sylvan god of shepherds. And as the wine went round, and the king grew boastful of his possessions, he exclaimed loudly that not even Apollo himself could produce such exquisite music as fell from the flute of Pan. The guests, remembering the fate of Marsyas, began to grow pale, and begged the king not to let his boast be heard. But King Midas laughed scornfully, and raising his drinking cup above his head, called out to Apollo to appear. Well, to the surprise and dismay of all, the god of music, Apollo, suddenly stood before them, beautiful as the dawn, and glowing with divine wrath. Though Pan himself was a deity, he had no desire to challenge Apollo, and looked fearfully at the sun god's angry frown. But the king, drunk with pride, commanded him to play, and bade the god of music surpass the playing if he could. There was, of course, no question as to which was the better musician, and the guests loudly proclaimed Apollo the victor. One story tells that, to prove further the superiority of Apollo's playing, the company went to the old mountain god Tmolus, to let him make the final decision. Timoleus had to clear the trees from his ears to listen, and having done this he bent his head, and all the trees leaned down with him. He heard with delight both musicians play, but when he heard the last soft notes fall from Apollo's lyre, the mountain god awarded him the victory. But Midas, at the beginning of the contest, had demanded the right to decide on the merits of the players, and he would not accept this verdict. In his mad perversity and fondness for his favorite, he cried out that Pan was the better player, and he would therefore be awarded the prize. Well, angered by this unfair decision, Apollo left the banquet hall, but not before he had assured Midas that justice would be done. These words came true in a most unexpected way, for when the king looked into his mirror the next morning, he found a pair of large, fuzzy donkey's ears growing in the place of his own ones. Horrified at his absurd appearance, Midas did not show himself to his people, but sent in haste for a barber and bade him to make a wig large enough to cover the monstrous ears. For many hours the barber was closeted with the king, and when the wig was finished, he was allowed to finally leave the palace, of course after having sworn never to reveal the king's misfortune under pain of death. For some time the secret was safely kept, but the poor barber found life unbearable, since he lived in constant fear of letting out the truth about the king's ears in spite of his frantic efforts to be silent. Whenever Midas appeared in the city streets, the barber had to rush home and shut himself up, lest he should scream out the story of the wig. One day he thought of a happy solution of his difficulty, and one that broke his long seal of silence, without endangering his life, of course. He went out into the fields, dug a deep hole, and, putting his head down as far as he could, he shouted out, "King Midas has donkey's ears! King Midas has donkey's ears!" And then he went home again, much happier for having told someone of his secret, even though it was only Mother Earth. But the truth once told did not stay hidden even in the earth, for in that time the hole was filled again, and reeds grew over the spot, and as the wind swayed back and forth, they murmured, "King Midas has donkey's ears." It was not long before all the people in the countryside had gathered to hear the strange whispering of the reeds, and then the secret could be kept no longer. But though everyone knew the truth, King Midas continued to wear his wig, and no one ever really saw the true size of his ears. The love of Apollo. Like his father, Jupiter, the young Apollo was not content to stay always in the shining halls of Olympus, but spent many days wandering over the broad lands of Greece in search of adventure, or for the sake of some maiden's love. There were many fair ones among the daughters of men, and they were wont to look with favor upon the beautiful young god who came down from the high heavens to woo them. Each morning, as he drove across the sky with the fiery horses that were harnessed to the chariot of the sun. Some maiden gazed with longing splendor above her, and prayed that the radiant Apollo might look kindly upon her. Seldom did these prayers go unanswered, but sometimes the heart of the god was untouched by the devotion so freely offered, and the maiden pined away over her hopeless love. Such a one was Cleite, who worshipped the glorious sun god, and longed in secret for his love. But in spite of her tears and sighing, she met with only coldness in return. Each day, before she rose before the dawn to greet Apollo, as soon as his chariot appeared in the heavens, and all day she watched him until the last rays of light were lost behind the hills. But the young god felt no sympathy for her sorrow, and the unhappy Cleite grew so pale and sick with longing that Jupiter, in pity, changed her into a sunflower, that she might always stand watching the course of the sun, and turn her face forever towards him, no matter where his beams may shine. The great beauty of Apollo usually assured his success whenever he stooped from his high estate to love the maidens of the earth. But once he was repaid for his hard-heartedness to poor Cleite, and failed in his wooing when he sought the love of a beautiful wood nymph, Daphne. He was wandering one day in the forest, when he suddenly came upon Daphne as she was gathering flowers, and her beauty and grace so charmed him that he desired her love above everything else in the world. Not wishing to frighten her, he stood still and softly spoke her name. When the nymph heard his voice, she turned quickly and looked at him with the startled eyes of some wild forest creature. Surprise and fear held her for a moment, while Apollo spoke again, gently, and begged her, "Don't be afraid, for I am no hunter, nor even a rude shepherd." But Daphne only shrank away, fearful of his eagerness, and when Apollo grew bolder and ventured to draw near, she turned and fled through the forest. Angered at this rebuff, the god followed her, and though the nymph ran swiftly, she could not escape from her pursuer, who was now more than ever determined to win her. In and out among the trees she darted, hoping to bewilder him into giving up the chase. But Apollo kept close behind, and little by little gained on her by flying feet. Wearied but unyielding, Daphne now hurried her steps towards the stream at the edge of the forest, where she knew that she would find her father, the river god Peneus. As she neared to the stream, she cried aloud for him to help, and just as Apollo had reached her side and his outstretched hand was on her shoulder, a rough bark began to enclose her soft body in its protecting sheath. Green branches sprouted from the ends of her uplifted arms, and her floating hair became only waving leaves under the grasp of the god's eager fingers. Apollo stood dismayed at this transformation, and when he saw a laurel tree rooted in the spot where but a moment ago had stood the beautiful living maiden, he repented of his folly in having pursued her, and sat for many days beside the river, mourning her loss. Thus, it was that the laurel became the favorite tree of Apollo, and when the god returned sadly to Olympus, he decreed that whenever poet or musician or any victor in the games was to be crowned with a garland of leaves, that these leaves were taken from the laurel tree in memory of Daphne. In one of the flower-filled meadows of sunny Greece, there played all day a golden-haired boy named Phaeton, who was the pride and delight of his mother, Clymene, a stately maiden whom Apollo had once wooed and won. The boy was willful and headstrong at that, but beautiful as a young god indeed, and his mother, in her foolish pride, often reminded him how favored he was above all other children, because he was the son of Apollo. Each morning she led him to a place where he could see the sunrise, and told him that his father was just then harnessing the fiery steeds to his golden-wheeled cart, and would soon be leaving his palace of burnished gold to drive across the heavens, bringing daylight to the darkened earth. She told him of Apollo's great beauty, and of his wonderful music, and of his high position among the gods, because his chariot was nothing less than the glorious sun itself. Phaeton, well, he never tired of hearing these stories, and it was no wonder that he became so very proud of his divine parentage, and boastful of it towards his playmates. But the children only laughed at his wonderful tales, and to convince them he grew more arrogant in his bearing, until they, angered by his continued boast, bade him give the slightest bit of proof of his claims, or else be silent. Of course, this Phaeton could not do, so they taunted him with his godlike appearance, and sneered at his pretensions, until the boy, roused to action by their repeated insults, ran to his mother, and begged her to tell him whether he might not speak to his wonderful but unknown father, and obtain from him some proof to silence the children's tongues. Clymene hesitated to send the child on the long necessary journey, but yielding at last to his entreaties, she showed him the way to his father's palace. It was night when Phaeton set out, and he was obliged to travel quickly if he wished to reach his journey's end before the sun-cart left the golden portals of the east. The palace of the sun was marvelously wrought, and the light from its golden columns and glittering jeweled towers so dazzled the eyes of Phaeton that he was afraid to draw near. But remembering the taunts of his playmates, he grew ever bolder, and sought out his father to beg the boon for which he had travelled so far and so wearily. Now when Apollo from his golden and ivory throne saw the boy approaching, he welcomed him kindly, and called him by the name of Sun. Hearing this, Phaeton lost all fear, and told his father how the children had refused to believe Clymene's stories, and had taunted him because he could not prove the truth of his claims. The lofty brow of Apollo grew cloudy as he listened to Phaeton's words, and he promised to give the boy proof he desired by granting him any favor he might ask. Instantly, Phaeton demanded that he be allowed that very day to drive the sun chariot, for when those on the earth saw him in that exalted place, they could no longer refuse to believe that he was indeed the favored child of Apollo. Dismayed by this unexpected request, Apollo sought to persuade Phaeton to ask for another wish, for he knew that no hand but his own could guide the four-winged horses that were harnessed to the golden sun chariot. But the boy was determined to carry out his plan, and with all the willfulness of a conceited child, he refused to heed his father's warnings. As Apollo had sworn by the river Styx, the most terrible of all oaths, to grant Phaeton's request, whatever it may be, he was indeed obliged to fulfill his purpose, and very reluctantly he led the boy to the portals of the palace, where the impatient horses already stood, pawing the ground. Phaeton gazed at the sun chariot in delight, for it was all made of gold, except the spokes of the wheel, which were all of silver, and the body of the chariot was studded with chrysolites and diamonds that reflected the sun's dazzling brightness. The impatient boy sprung into the chariot and seized the reins in his hands, while his father bound on his head the blazing sun rays. But before the journey was begun, Apollo poured over him a cooling essence, that his skin might not be shriveled by the burning heat of the sun, and gave him careful instructions how to handle the restless steeds. Phaeton but half listened to these words, and fretted to be off on his triumphant course. So Apollo ordered the gates to be thrown open, and the sun chariot dashed out into the heavens. For a while, all went well, for the boy remembered his father's caution about using a whip on the fiery horses. But as the day wore on, he became reckless and forgot everything but his own proud triumph. Faster and faster he drove, flourishing the whip, and never heeding in what direction that the maddened horses sped. Soon he lost his way, and the chariot came so close to the earth that its fierce heat dried up the rivers and scorched the ground and shriveled up all vegetation, even turning the natives in that part of the country brown, which color they are still to this very day. Smoke rose up from the charred and blackened earth, and it so clouded the eyes of the now terrified Phaeton that he could not find his way back to the path of the sun, and drove wildly far away from the earth. This caused a terrible disaster, for under the sudden cold all growing things withered, and the blight of frost settled all over the land. And then a great cry arose from the people of the earth when they saw their country laid waste, and though Jupiter was fast asleep on his golden couch, even he heard the cry so far away and started up in surprise. What could be happening on the earth that the sound of human wailing should break in upon the silence of his dreams? One glance was sufficient enough for him to see the smoke rising from the burnt-up land, and to realize the cause of all that useless destruction, for far across the heavens, like a vanishing comet, Phaeton was madly driving the flaming chariot of the sun. Angered at the sight of a mere boy presuming to take upon himself so great a task, Jupiter seized one of his deadliest thunderbolts and hurled it at the unhappy youth, whose scorched body was immediately dashed from its lofty seat and sank into the calm waters of the Eridanus River. Clymene mourned her son's untimely death, and gathered his remains from the river, that they might have honorable burial. Phaeton's dearest friend, Cycnus, continued to haunt the river's edge, looking for any relic of his favorite, that might chance to rise to the surface in the water. In recognition of this devotion, the gods changed him into a swan that might stay forever on the river and plunge his head fearlessly into the clear waters to search some scattered fragments of his unfortunate friend. End of part 1.